Christmas is a special day in the Arvakian calendar that takes place on the 25th of December every year. Parents give their children a gift presented in a thing known as wrapping paper, which is falsely claimed to have been delivered by a fat, jolly old man dressed in blood red and ashen white called Santa Claus, who rides through the night sky on a magical blue-nosed equine in order to visit children as they lie asleep in bed, whereupon he gives them a very special surprise. Other than kids, few people care much about the special day, but it's an occasion going back to at least the time of the unicorns. Some surviving records, combined with oral tradition, suggest that the day once had other connotations, possibly being linked with an obscure old pagan religion. Similar things have been suggested of the other special days of Hanukkah and Kwanzaa, which coincidentally take place around the same time of year, but which are generally less commonly recognized and whose origins are even more obscure. Some controversy has arisen regarding the speculated pagan connotations of Christmas. There is limited evidence to suggest that the event may have once revolved around a deity other than the captain, which is scandalous enough in itself, but far more outrageous are the more recent findings that suggest a heretical rival cult was active at the same time, known as the Nashers. This cult seemingly clashed fiercely with the more orthodox group over an alleged cover-up of the truth, and followed a very different, far more sinister deity that they believed to have brutally tortured, murdered, and devoured the orthodox group's god, and who appears so monstrous in nature as to cast a chilling shadow over the entire Christmas tradition. A growing movement is coming to feel that the event shouldn't be recognized at all in a captained world, and in fact the captaincy has proposed a ban on the event due to these possible pagan elements. Most notoriously, the captaincy advocate the banning of the traditional Christmas food of minced pies that children leave out for Santa and his magical equine to enjoy, and which are now believed to have been associated with the Nashers, with critics expressing particular concern over the unclear source of the mincemeat in the pies currently produced by the Meat King food chain. The captaincy are especially concerned that the beloved figure of Santa Claus may have some link to the deities worshipped by these old pagan cults, in which case they argue it would be sacrilege to teach children to believe in him. The suggestion of banning Christmas has, however, been met with a furious backlash by the world's children, who have characterized this as a heavy-handed war on gifts that the nanny-knows-best state is trying to wage to take our culture away from us and supplant it with those other weird days of Hanukkah and Kwanzaa, in what they call a grand replacement of their own cultural identity. Many such children further argue that the excavated documents corroborating the supposed pagan links with Christmas were in fact planted by the captaincy to be discovered by Arvakian state authorities, who they had conspired with in what the kids call a false flag operation, and that this was all done in order to justify this cultural warfare project. The complete and utter absence of evidence for literally any of these claims does not dampen the children's resolve in the slightest, leading many to suspect they have ulterior motives for making them. As it happens, children are somewhat infamous for adopting reactionary political stances in this vein, much to the chagrin of the far less territorial and far more re-educated older generation. Although in this case it's generally perceived that the children's claimed political grievances are held insincerely, and they only really care about not getting their presents. Conversely, older people tend to sympathize more with the captaincy's position, since any implication of pagan influence in popular culture tends to be viewed with grave concern by adults, whereas it's viewed with increasing sympathy by the youth. Regarding Hanukkah and Kwanzaa, no evidence has emerged to shed any light on their origins, although some speculate a connection to the aforementioned Nashers, albeit with no legitimate grounds for doing so. There is a widely reported phenomenon of Sharipian children mysteriously disappearing across the country. Rumors persist of some connection to the notorious developer of modern game sets, LGN, who are somehow able to create brand new game sets, despite there being no known method for doing this. These children aren't to be confused with the Firefly Kids, which were an entirely different thing. The Firefly Kids are all popularly believed to have starved to death, although rumors persist that 2 of them survived the sealing of Tillienberg. Many Tetrationes, sapient 4-piece blocks, flee the Arvakian, aka Destonian, empire to Bestia, aka Asvinia, but common consensus is that they will most likely suffer the same fate, as almost all would be illegal immigrants. If the military don't get them, the civilian lynch mobs probably will, since decades of state propaganda, as published through the RVCA News, Estonia's best and only newspaper, have given most civilians a murderous hatred for illegal immigrants. For much of the general public, this contempt has extended to all immigrants in general, possibly because immigration itself is illegal. But the RVCA News officially condemns this sentiment and insists they're not responsible for spreading or encouraging it in any way. While we're on the subject, the RVCA News is also well known for these positions, that the 1% tax on the rich is too high, that the 500% tax on the poor is too low, that the persecution of eons past and present has been grossly exaggerated, and that eons who complain about it are whiners, who should be publicly flogged until they apologize. The same applies to the poor, together with all minority and non-mainstream groups who ever complain about anything, that any family failing to tune into the Daily Emperor Demark is the best wireless broadcast, and sing along with the Arvikayan national anthem in full without getting the words wrong should all get at least 4 years in jail. That the death sentence currently given to all citizens over 5 years old who failed to make the Arvikayan Pledge of Allegiance the prescribed 100 times per day should be changed to apply to all citizens over 4 instead, and that anyone who questions anything the RVCA News ever says should be executed along with everyone living in a 1-mile radius of their home, up to and including the rest of their town or village, unless of course they're questioning something from an old edition of the RVCA News that a later edition has since contradicted, in which case the radius extends to 3 miles. David McDavidson hosts Play Your Prices Correctly, his smash success game show, where he doesn't suck your blood, he isn't a vampire. Before the wireless was invented, he used to host this show in person at community centers in upper-class areas of Arvich. The idea of the game show is that each contestant gets a set of 5 cards. Each card has a random price written on the front, which each player conceals from the other players. The contestants are presented with a common store-bought item and have to play the price that they think is closest to the actual price the studio paid for it. Since the prices each contestant receives are random, a player can be advantaged or disadvantaged by the cards they hold, even if they know the value of the item. Therefore, part of the game is for the players to offer card trades with each other, all without letting any of the other players know how much confidence they have in the cards they hold. In the end, each player plays a price, and the one closest to the real price wins. Prizes range from a pack of chewing gum to a bag of paper clips. The show is very popular, although nobody really understands why, as the basic concept is extremely mundane and tedious, and the host is broadly seen as uncharismatic with his bizarre habit of making strange guttural noises like EEE, WWW, and EAE, EO, EAA, WHH all the time. Also, for some reason, many players that have appeared on the game show have subsequently been reported missing. Nobody really knows what the deal is there. The Walt Disney Company are a much-loved wireless broadcast corporation from the far west that have spent the last decade taking classical Western folk tales and adapting them into audio, wireless broadcast form. Following the founder's death, however, there is a sense that the corporation might have strayed from his original vision for the organization. Sentiments to this effect first came out when guests leaving Walt's funeral were confronted with merchandise kiosks on the way out, and encouraged to purchase branded toys and gramophone records to remember Mr. Disney by. This was very swiftly followed by an unexpected announcement that every single one of Disney's broadcasts was going to get a stage play remake, for no apparent reason, in spite of the complete and utter absence of public demand for any of his broadcasts to be remade at the time, and the painfully obvious fact that people still feel the exact same way 5 years later, even as these remakes continue to get trotted out without explanation, every single one of which is unanimously agreed to be inferior to the original. Some other bizarre trends include the removal from all Walt Disney's official photographs of his famous walking stick, making him look like he's about to fall over in all of them. None of the controversies, however, have matched that over the recent proposal to remake their famous broadcast Song of the Fistful of Dollars, for which the creators are forging friendly diplomatic relations with the Arvich Empire so as to get permission to record the remake's audio in the natural ambience of Tillienburg, the very city in which the Firefly kids are strongly suspected to have been systematically genocided as part of a cover-up of what happened there by the Arvichian state, in spite of Arvich's continued official denial of these allegations. It's perceived that the far western Wisney Corporation gravely miscalculated the Eastern sentiment on this incredibly explosive subject. Too many. This is evidenced by their strangely dismissive Puerto Rico statement that Arvich has officially stated that the genocide never officially happened and that there would be no reason for concern in any case, as only 2 minutes of the hour-long play soundtrack are going to be recorded at the site of the slow, prolonged, agonized starvation of the orphan children, who are, again, popularly believed to have had their famine artificially inflicted upon them by the very state with whom the Wisney Corporation is now cooperating in order to produce their redundant stage play that nobody wanted them to make in the first place. Wisney summed things up by saying that we just want to remake happy memories for children to remember again the whole world over. Wisney's Puerto Rico officials later said they were shocked and dismayed by the negative public reaction to their defense, and their current CEO assured that I really am so very truly sorry that you feel that way. Against all expectations, they went ahead with producing and releasing the stage play anyway, which unsurprisingly flopped horribly, and they are still continuing with their remakes in spite of the already dismal public interest crashing like a rock in the light of the Firefly Kids scandal. Announcements have even been made that Wisney intend to start remaking some of the older remakes in the near future, which has really started people asking about what on earth the motivation for all this even is. It's seen as nonsensical that the company would choose to spend vast amounts of money making inferior remakes of their far more beloved classic broadcasts, when they could just re-release said classic broadcasts on gramophone records, something they stubbornly and inexplicably refuse to do outside of a single dedicated day of each year. Some commentators have speculated that the Wisney enterprise in its modern form are really just a soulless, money-grubbing, faceless bunch of corporate husks fraudulently gatekeeping the inspired visionary works of a dead creative genius, cannibalizing and parasiting off of his legacy, like maggots for no real purpose other than to extract as much money from his desiccated, cryogenically frozen corpse as possible. There is a rumor that this is actually quite literally what's happening, with the popular notion that Wisney himself used advanced scientific methods to freeze his body in order of it to be used in future to save his company from bankruptcy. How he would have achieved this is unknown, but there's an attendant rumor that it somehow involved him forcibly pushing hundreds of innocent Lemongians off a cliff to their untimely end deaths, and staging it as a voluntary act to throw authorities off the trail. Whatever the truth is, the Wisney Corporation is going from strength to strength with their aggressive merchandising. One wonders where it's all heading, though. The singing Dolphinians, Melward, YUOLL, and Tio are understood to be heading to the Mower Show, but nobody knows why, though there's a rumor going around that they want to express their thanks for something. The aquatic eons, or wateries, as some refer to them, despite it generally being seen as a hateful term, tend to keep to themselves, since it hasn't ended well for them in the past, when they don't. There are exceptions, though, but exceptions that prove the rule. Bestia's Liberative Party, or the South Wing, as they're colloquially called, has been around since democracy was first implemented in Bestia, over 25 years ago. In chronological order, its presidents have included Borald Sumpson Sr., Borald Sumpson Sr., Borald Sumpson Sr., Borald Sumpson, Trillery Luston, Borald Sumpson's stepsister, and current President Doris Tronjan, Borald Sumpson's daughter, who both he and his wife Margaret still deny he had an affair with his personal servant Veronica Shrewinski to conceive. The Liberative stand for tight controls on immigration, except when they don't, lower taxes for the richest earners, except when they don't, the persecution of convenient scapegoats in society to help them push their politics, which they always do, and a variety of other extremely divisive, polarizing, awful things that make everybody's lives worse. Bestia's Concerebro Party, or the North Wing, as they're colloquially called, has also been around since democracy was first implemented in Bestia, over 25 years ago. In chronological order, its presidents have included Margaret Sampson Sr., Margaret Sampson Sr., Margaret Sampson, and Margaret Sampson Jr. The concerebrals stand for loose controls on immigration, except when they don't, higher taxes for the richest earners, except when they don't, the persecution of convenient scapegoats in society to help them push their politics, which they always do, and a variety of other extremely divisive, polarizing, awful things that make everybody's lives worse. There was a magic school for witchcraft and wizardry, or Magul, as they're colloquially known, that was famous for having a previous holy child as one of its students. She rebelled against her institution and became a Goscurithian, painting her face white and buying all her clothes from a shop called Hot Topic. There was some other kid with glasses there that was supposed to be special as well, but he was just some stupid prep, so who cares what happened to him? The former holy child went on to join the Toilet Liberation Front, TLF, and fight for the rights of toiletians to restrict eons from using them, which, as laughable as that sounds, was a strangely popular cause at the time. Its advocates, who were mostly humans and monkeys, were insistent that they were only motivated by concern for toiletians' rights, although most eons, including the toiletians themselves, believed there was a more sinister ulterior motive. Whatever the case, it made waves. Even today, eons are still expected to find a bush, including the toiletians. Maguls are well known for their home system, a well-respected institution, where the children attending a school are separated from each other and divided up into arbitrary home groups, and then actively encouraged to antagonize all children in the other homes and view them as rivals, while viewing all children from their own home as a friend and ally in the struggle against all the other homes. Some commentators have suggested that this tribalism may be a very unhealthy and problematic mindset to be artificially imposing upon young, impressionable children, and could be liable to lead them to adopt divisive worldviews where they hold entire swaths of their society in contempt out of a blind sense of tribal loyalty, a mindset that is likely to stay with them their whole lives. The school's upper management, all of whom were former students themselves, have collectively condemned such sentiments as the footless views of whiny, entitled, snowflake liberative elite concerebral elite coconut cultural Marxist unwoke values signaling bourgeois gamins who want to come over here and go over there and take our culture away from us and give our culture back to us like the submissive, domineering, little oversized meek dictators they are and aren't, and that there is no evidence that these supposed arbitrary tribal mentalities persist with the children into adulthood, let alone that they even exist in the first place. Joffred Barks was an Arvakian Treeon academic from well over 100 years ago, famous for his political ideology, Barksism, which proposed to revolutionize society by dispossessing all upper-class citizens of their wealth and resources, and transferring it all to the lower classes. It would then be at the lower classes' discretion as to how this money should be paid to their nobles and superiors based on how much they felt was appropriate for them to do their jobs, as well as how much they felt they had earned it. Barks's thesis was that the poor and lower-class citizens would be better placed to manage said resources, being the people most heavily affected by what the upper classes do with their wealth. Thus, the poor could manage the wealth and hand it out to the upper classes, as they saw fit to, which would lead to the best possible results for everyone. He himself called this system trickling-up economics, but the term Barksism has since stuck. Barks was unable to get much support from the powers that be in Arvich, for some reason, and so he went to the far west, where they were more receptive. The system was implemented, but there were soon complaints by the aristocratic classes that the newly rich lower classes weren't paying them reasonably. There was a common perception that the lower classes were hoarding the wealth for themselves and willfully withholding it from the aristocrats with dubious justification. This ultimately led the upper classes to begin a practice they called aristocratical action, where they would refuse to do their own work, like settling inter-shogunate disputes and pumping their money into public welfare projects. In response to this, instead of raising the upper classes' pay, the lower classes banded together in things they called corporations, in a move to make the aristocrats redundant to the functioning of society. Although Barksism is controversial in Arvich, it's commonly believed that capitalism owes its very existence and subsequent rapid expansion to this development, without which it may never have entered Arvich or modern-day Bestia. Its controversy is at least in part due to a prevailing sense that Joffrey Barks was deeply prejudiced against the upper classes, and that his Marxist manifesto was dripping with implications of resentment and disrespect for them. His notorious attitude towards the left-handed, who he falsely believed to be far more powerful and wealthy than they actually were, doesn't help matters. The old house of Mo, also known as Castle Bestia, is the site where the Mower Show will be held. Nobody knows why it was built, but they do know it's over 1,000 years old, and it used to just be called the Old House, which makes it the oldest known landmark in the world from a long-forgotten age. Popular folk belief has it that the reason why nobody knows anything about those olden days is because the unicorn systematically dismantled all historical knowledge from the humans and Eoness cultures and destroyed almost all evidence of their past. What few artifacts and bits of folklore remain suggest that the unicorns hadn't shown up yet at the time the old house was built, which is supported by the manifest, one of the very few remaining documents from before those times, which, in its complete breakdown of all living things and their evolutionary history, makes no mention of unicorns. The only ones who might possibly know anything more are the dragons, who by all accounts were never subjugated. And they aren't talking. Especially not now. If there's a profit to be made, there's nothing they won't use manipulative and exploitative and deceitful and disrespectful tactics to sell you. Buy things from our company corporation, CRTM or BTC. CRTM, for short, are a generally well-respected company originating in the region now known as Bestia, but which rapidly spread throughout Arvich and its colonies over a century ago to the point they are now unquestionably the most powerful corporation in the known world, with their wealth and annual profit margins eclipsing those of their rivals and even many Arvikian colonies' state treasures. In spite of this, for some mysterious reason, the company's executives pay their employees the worst wages of any contemporary employer and charge what is commonly considered disproportionately high prices for their products. Workers in their factories are infamously known to be timed on their inhalations and blinks, with those who breathe or blink too rapidly being under constant threat of termination and subsequent lawsuits for breach of contract. Acceptable breathing and blinking rates are outlined in the terms and conditions of employment for all low-level positions. Their delivery workers, composed entirely of ungulations and traineons, are expected to work 36-hour shifts without breaks and have a wireless surgically grafted into their flesh that is configured to play lounge roll and rock music during working hours to keep them awake. Despite the reverence in which the company is generally held, some have questioned their ethics, suggesting that their working conditions and general practices are not very nice. Such criticisms are invariably met with a venomous response from their faceless executive board, none of whose identities are known, but who are popularly believed to literally have no faces, who argue that their practices are consistent with traditional corporate culture, which is technically true for Eons, and that the idea that there's something fundamentally objectionable about what they do is the product of a mind virus that has infected modern humanity and Eonity. The company take this notion seriously and have dedicated biochemical researchers working to try and prove their theory, hoping to identify a vaccine or cure for the postulated virus. Verusians protest that there is no evidentiary basis for the claim, and that it's yet another example of stigma against Verusians, scapegoating them for society's problems as usual, while some others simply think it's a really stupid thing to even suggest in the first place, and that the scientists who support it have ulterior motivations for doing so. Geoffrey Goatsucker, the chief executive of one of the company's biggest rivals and the world's most prominent philanthropist, is one of their fiercest critics, calling their practices horrible and barbaric, in spite of the popular perception that his own company behaves more or less the same way, and that his philanthropy is really an egomaniacal vanity project that costs the Destonian taxpayers a fortune through the 110% tax relief he receives on all his charitable endeavors. He has engaged in passionate debates over wireless broadcast with the BTC, CRTM executive team, and one broadcast infamously got so heated that Geoffrey was challenged to a professional wrestling death match at his own private island to settle the dispute, to which he shockingly responded, "Name the date and time." This led to a several-month-long media sensation that ultimately came to nothing, with many business people heralding it as a bold, revolutionary, and inspiring new approach to business dispute settlement, while a few commentators felt that the entire thing was a ridiculous, farcical, childish way to settle a dispute, and that it reflected extremely badly on the managerial competence and maturity level of the parties involved, and that anybody who would ever do something like this to address criticism in a professional or even personal context was clearly not responsible or sound-minded enough to handle a position of enormous power and authority over the working lives of tens of millions of people, and the provision of products and services to hundreds of millions of consumers around the entire world. Such commentators have faded away in recent times, possibly because BTC's official response to these commentators was to brand them as child molesters, leading to them being killed by lynch mobs, despite the complete absence of evidence for the accusations. The company later defended themselves by saying, "We were just joking." Giraffe Goat Sucker's private island, incidentally, is a very popular holiday destination for the world's richest and most powerful people, not including Emperor Damaric, who only went once and didn't see what all the fuss was about. The scenery was drab, the food wasn't great, and worst of all, the other VIPs kept taking his pork pie waitresses away. In addition to buy things from our company corporation, CRTMS biochemical scientists researching the mind virus that the corporation believes to be responsible for all opinions on corporate practice that go against those of their executive team. They also have psychologists working on the mental component of the problem. The head of this research subdivision, Dr. Niles Palmer, frequently gives lectures on how his tireless research work has determined that eons have inferior intelligence and professional competence to that of humans and monkeys, and thus all efforts to improve the lot of eons in modern society are inherently wrong-headed, citing that they are now in the position they rightly deserve to be in, and therefore should shut up about their problems. For that matter, Palmer's rigorous research has also determined that this applies to all people in any kind of position of minority or disadvantage relative to mainstream society, and also that those who deviate from orthodox beliefs or tendencies in any way are arrogant, delusional, and deserve to be held in contempt. There are also some of those minorities who he believes simply don't exist in the first place, and the idea that they do is also a product of the mind virus. Some commentators have suggested that his woolly psychoanalytical theories and research efforts are actually nothing more than a thinly veiled and cynical cover for his own rather obvious political agendas, and that they say far more about his own biases and preconceptions than they do about anything concerning wider society or the nature of the mind virus. In light of the growing levels of intolerance and tension in general society that have been directly traced to Dr. Palmer and his lecture tours, some universities have started turning down his applications to speak at their conferences in favor of less controversial and generally more scientifically sound-minded and less seemingly disingenuous speakers. This development has led Palmer and his corporation to launch a campaign officially backed by the Arvikayan government and various other extremely powerful and influential entities, arguing that they are being muted by the establishment for boldly telling truths that the man doesn't want to hear. Emperor Damaric himself gives his full endorsement and support to this message, providing vast resources at the taxpayer's expense to help Palmer punch up words and tell truth to power, like the poor, set upon underdog he is. Palmer backs up his claims by citing that fellow academics like Professors Mary Sherry and D.C. Whiteley have suffered similar treatment by the elites. Sherry, a textiles professor, spearheaded the Toilet Liberation Front, TLF, in order to liberate toiletians, until she started to receive a strange and disturbing reaction that she described as criticism from toiletians who felt she didn't represent them at all despite her claims, and that she had sinister ulterior motivations for her actions. Whiteley, a folk music professor, who abruptly and unexpectedly abandoned his academic position after Bestia decided to remove one of the 5 walls separating their country from Arvich, has been manically street preaching around Arvich about how horrible of a development this is. He argues that it is cataclysmically important that this motion is urgently overturned as an imperial imperative, and cites numerous dubious conspiracy theories as evidence to support his position, until said conspiracy theories are roundly debunked, at which point he assures he was just joking about them. When it was pointed out to him that the Bestian wall removal motion will take years to even get off the ground, and that in any case there are 4 other walls to separate Arvich from Bestia, He was reported to have started frothing at the mouth and collapsed into fist-banging fits, like someone suffering a seizure or a small child being told that the circus isn't till tomorrow. Some regional leaders and councils started to ban him from his preaching due to such unsettling behaviors, amid questions of how his folk music qualifications entitle him to be taken any more seriously than anybody else with regard to his political views, a question that has been asked of various other academics who command significant attention on public discourse about matters that have nothing to do with their academic discipline, and about which they consistently display an overwhelming ignorance, to the point that some commentators suspect they're just irresponsibly abusing their position of authority and status to try to push wider society down whatever political path is to their personal preference, and in so doing satisfy their own swollen, ivory tower egos. In any case, Dr. Palmer, plucky underdog that he is, has managed to get the upper management of all universities that declined his applications quarantined under the Mind Virus Act. In spite of what some continue to believe, eons aren't all derived from animals or even from living things. For example, Synbios, aka Ralph, of the Mower Force is popularly believed to be a colorion, a sapient living embodiment of one or more colors, in his case white, hence his being colored in white from top to bottom. Popularly believed, because of course he can't speak, and he's notoriously reserved about what personal information he communicates by other means. Some believe him to be part Sharipian, thinking his white coloration is a product of some kind of overabundance of thin white wool. There's all kinds of eons they can interbreed, and it gets really weird. Also, due to the physical resemblance to humans of many eon species, to say nothing of what they call half-breeds who are considered eons by default, it's not always obvious if someone's an eon or not. Some of them try to hide it. The Harlem Globetrotters are gigantions, i.e. giants, trotting around the world, which the manifest insists has the shape of a globe, contrary to increasingly popular belief, and strangely prone to bumping into the groovy gang. Something of note is that gigantions can be derived from any species of eon, and can also be humans, such as the globetrotters or monkeys, which led some to think they shouldn't really be considered a distinct type of eon in the first place. The label has stuck, though. Fred Flintstone used to be well loved for his wireless show, even though the captaincy protested its depiction of humans and dinosaurs living at the same time, which goes against the manifest, but he went down a very dark path, and that's all in the past now. For all his world-spanning Destonian NPR, nothing really matters to him in the face of what King Benetram did to his precious bestia, in spite of how small and insignificant the former colony really is. Now nothing drives him more mad than the thought that Benetram might be mistaken for some sort of Destonian, rather the sad, un-NPR-able wretch he really is. Considering how easily the NPR has dominated most of the entire world, an inquisitive viewer might wonder why they haven't just stomped all over Bestia and forcibly re-annexed it. The explanation for this is twofold. First, there is a magical protective barrier around most of the entire country, rendering unauthorized access impossible by sea or air. Second, the only land connection to Destonia, aka Arvich, is at Bestia's southern border, which isn't protected by the aforementioned magic barrier, but rather by a series of 5 enormous structures known as the Great Walls of Bestia. All attempts to break these walls down and invade have been thwarted, thanks to the vigilant Gaulds, short for Walls Guards, the Bestian troops that guard the walls, and their Zebrion commanders, Krosterisk and Monolisk, with Bestia quickly repairing what little damage was done after every attempt. While the Great Walls were surreptitiously built by the Bestians in anticipation of their plotted secession from the NPR, the country-spanning magical barrier was a well-known phenomenon long before the secession, and indeed seems to predate all recorded history. Domeric can only hope that the thing fades away at some point, as modern-day magicians have no idea how such a powerful effect was ever put in place, let alone how it stayed up for centuries. Also, it wasn't easy singing that high note, but good old Emperor Domeric did it. Must be all the pies. There's a lot of Arvich imperial history here. Official history, at least. But also actual history. It didn't start with Domeric. Not by a long shot. But if the wishes come true, it will end with him. Had the re-education establishments done their job right, his subjects would see that as a big if. The bestie at times frequently protests the making of offensive and insensitive public statements by prominent figures in positions of heavy sway and influence, arguing that it's irresponsible of such people to do so, given their messages could potentially gain traction in wider society. Hence it amounts to them exploiting their position to spread hateful sentiments. This extends to the use of language that is popularly perceived as disrespectful towards vulnerable groups such as YUORs, which comprise the majority of the paper's reader base. Their position is generally seen as honorable in spirit by the wider Bestian public, although the newspaper's frequent campaigns to forcibly remove the aforementioned public figures from their positions of prominence and bury their reputation into the ground when they are perceived to have crossed this line has been seen by some commentators as a hypocritical display of precisely the same sort of abuse of power by a highly influential media entity, whose claims and campaigns can heavily affect large swaths of the public's attitude towards prominent figures. It's also been suggested that the Times may have some double standards about this sort of thing, such as the time when one of its journalists remarked that she would like to corner Geoffrey Goatsucker in a dark alley and throw acid in his filthy corporate face until the wretched Fakion flesh melted off of his scheming money-grubbing skull, or the time when it was claimed that notorious police chief Earthworm Jim Sickrow's method of slowly and deliberately choking Burdian offenders to death on the street in full public view was a tactic taught to him by the left-hander's secret service, the Sinister Seven, a controversial organization whose very existence is generally seen as a crackpot conspiracy theory. The Times' notorious history of persecuting left-handers is something they proclaim to deeply regret and to have since moved on from, although many perceive in their writings a tendency to tap into traditional anti-left-handed narratives when they find it useful to pursue their political agendas to a degree that suggests they don't really regret anything at all and still harbor bigoted sentiments regarding the left-handed community. It's noteworthy as well that Geoffrey and Jim are both YUORs, and when it was leveled that the paper's arguably hateful coverage of them could have harmful consequences to fellow members of their species, the Times defended itself by saying that Geoffrey and Jim had betrayed their species through their actions and weren't real members of them. This defense was addressed in letters to the editor as a dangerous sentiment, to be encouraging and potentially compromising to the already vulnerable position of most YUORs in modern society, stoking tribalistic fires that some would say are precisely the kinds of thing modern society should be trying to move on from rather than actively play into. The Times' response to these letters, which had been mostly sent in by YUORs, was to vaguely imply that the letter writers were themselves not real YUORs and should remove themselves from their gene pool, without explicitly saying so in a way that might be legally actionable against them via modern YUOR hate crime laws. This scandalous development has led some commentators to question if the Times and similar media entities aren't in fact complete hypocrites who don't really care about the plight of YUORs or any other persecuted group in society except insofar as it helps them to push their ulterior political agendas and make as much money as possible by maintaining their market share over the paper purchasing public. The response to such accusations was that the accusers weren't real YUOR sympathizers either, at which point some started to draw comparisons of the Times editorial staff's position with the Buy Things From Our Company Corporation, CRTM, and their infamous mind virus theory, a comparison that the Times is offended by as they insist they are nothing like that foul exploitative bourgeois organization and the champagne-clinking commercialist humans come counter-revolutionaries that run it. Bestia likes to present itself as a more egalitarian and fair place to live than the Arvich Empire, from which it very acrimoniously split around 30 years ago. As such, its political journalism is much more confrontational in holding the Bestian aristocracy to account for perceived abuses of power and authority, since, if it were Arvich, said aristocrats would never be meaningfully held accountable for anything. Bestia's aggressive political accountability approach extends even to the state-run Bestian Broadcasting Corporation, or BBC for short, whose interviewers and journalists are said to be biting the hand that feeds them. Most prominent among these figures is Toremi Puckman, an infamously antagonistic political interviewer who is uncompromising in his treatment of the powerful figures he holds to account. Perhaps Puckman's most emblematic interview concerned a high-ranking Bestian nobleman, Angelo Nestor, who had recently been accused of using unethical intimidation tactics to whip one of his underlings into submission. Puckman put this issue to Nestor with the simple question, "Did you threaten to undermine him?" Nestor gave a predictably vague and warbly non-answer to this pointed question, invoking a standard political method commonly used to minimize the risk of compromising one's position in the public eye. This measure is similar in kind to the Bestian right to not engage with the police without legal counsel, which is a right that practically all educated legal experts would strongly recommend all citizens to adopt when engaging with law and order. Puckman's response to Nestor invoking this political equivalent of legal common sense was to repeat his question, "Did you threaten to undermine him?" moving Nestor to again give a non-answer in response, since by this point he could then pull out of the interview without looking bad. Puckman subjected him to the exact same question again, eliciting yet another variation on the same non-answer, which Puckman might have expected, by this point, to be the only answer he was ever going to get to his question. 5 hours and 1,580 repetitions of the same question later, the interview was forcibly concluded when the broadcast studio's janitor turned off the transmitter for the night. The BBC and other established Bestian commentators have always lauded Puckman's conduct in this interview, for him boldly holding Nestor to account, whereas Arvikian detractors have always seen his conduct in this interview as a protracted bout of petty, vindictive bullying that completely derailed what could have otherwise been an informative interview into a dead end that elicited nothing of value for listeners who had tuned in for an edifying exchange on wider political topics, and in the end Nestor never really was held to account at all. Other examples of Puckman's sharp wit in action include his suggestion that the elderly should all die, that Northern Bestia is a colonial subjugator of the Bestian government, despite it accounting for less than 10% of Bestian politicians, while covering over a third of the total Bestian landmass, and the time when he punched someone in the face for slightly overcooking one of his eggs for breakfast once. Arvikian critics cite examples like these as evidence that Puckman's gratuitous vitriol in his interviewing approach, coupled with his obvious frustration with basically everyone and everything he ever works with, are counterproductive to the informative political discourse that it's his job to facilitate. Said critics feel his aggressive interviewing persona might really be a shallow front he has constructed to mask what is actually an arrogant, resentful, sneering man who considers himself superior to the self-serving cogs in the political machine who he engages with, despite him arguably being a similar such cog himself. He comes across to Arvikians like an aloof, godlike watcher from on high, tossing tomatoes at the actors wheeled out before him for his own spiteful amusement, and reveling in their prolonged torture like a cat toying with a wounded mouse. Increasingly Bestians are coming to sympathize with the long-standing Arvikian perception that Puckman is really just a glorified bully who merely undercuts and muddies the conversation on the issues that he's supposed to be having with his adversary. He hurls petty insults at them, making them look bad, and by extension making himself look better than them, when he should instead concentrate on rational debate of the specific political issues that he is employed and paid a disproportionately high wage to discuss with them. The fact he commands said wage for services of such debatable merit and such self-importance has inspired some to ask if he's really so different from the so-called slimy elite of Bestia and Arvich he is employed to talk to. The Knights of the Round, Arthur the Human, Lancelot the Chimp, and Percival/Percival/Percival/Percival/Percival/Percival/etc. are self-proclaimed heroes to travel the world righting wrongs such as saving damsels in distress. The legend cheeses just an old wives' tale. Everybody knows they'll never find it. But the crown of the Unicorn Queen is another matter. It's said that one time, the Knights of the Round tried to rescue a fair maiden who was trapped at the very top of a windmill. She let down her hair and called down for Percival to climb up and free her, but Arthur corrected her pronunciation of his name, which led to an argument between the knights that went on for so long that by the time it finished she had already freed herself. As it happens, the knights have a long history with windmills that they'd like to put behind them. Goblinians are not eons. They're despised and shunned, possibly because whenever they get involved in anything, all orderly sense and reason seems to break down and everything they try to do just degenerates into anarchy, which leads to all kinds of problems for everyone involved. In a world that wants to stay as far away from them as possible, they've largely turned to crime to make ends meet, worsening their bad reputation. They're very subservient by nature, willing to follow orders by their leaders blindly and without question, which is why they get taken advantage of by insidious, money-grubbing, ethically bankrupt businessmen like Boss Barnes, whoever he is. Don't know how these guys got involved with him or who he even is, but he snapped them up in any case. The Bestian Democratic People's Government, currently ruled by the Liberative Party, have recently been pushing to overturn former President Boris Johnson's motion to demolish one of the 5 Great Walls of Bestia that separate the country from its hated enemy, Arvich. The demolition project, which had previously been pushed to uphold the democratic will of the people given that the Bestian public had voted 50.01% in favor of it, was in its nascent planning stages when the next by-election happened in an obscure Bestian state, which saw the Liberative candidate win with a majority vote of 50.003%. The Liberatives' immediate response to this election result was to argue that it served as proof that it was the democratic will of the people for the wall demolition project to be scrapped, since doing so had been part of their latest election manifesto. Some concerebral commentators opined that there was no real way to know to what extent the party had been elected in this obscure state on the basis of their proposed anti-wall demolition project rather than on any of the other parts of their broader political manifesto, to say nothing of the various other factors that have been proven to generally affect voting decisions such as party loyalty, protest voting, and tactical voting. The Liberatives characterize such commentators as anti-democratic, which seems to be a common accusation leveled by both the concerebrals and Liberatives against anybody who ever questions anything they ever do while in power. Concerebral commentators have also questioned whether the whole project really is democratic, given that the wider net of democratically elected politicians have been aggressively trying to shut the project down under a collective banner known as the Anti-Demolition Abolitionism movement, being voted in after having publicly pledged to do this. This movement previously included a substantial proportion of politicians from the Liberative Party itself, to which the party's response was to fire all of said democratically elected politicians as traitors to the democratic will of the people, and then replace them according to the personal preference of their leader Doris, who had herself been similarly brought in by her party to replace the replacement of Boris Johnson several minutes after Boris himself had been replaced by the person who Doris has now replaced. When this wasn't sufficient to get the abolition movement passed, the Liberative Party leader, Doris Tronjan, proceeded to petition King Benetram with an obscure political injunction to rogue squadron the parliament. This essentially meant that all the politicians were kicked out of the government building and held hostage by a paramilitary death squad, until Doris had ratified the preliminary abolition bill, which she found quite easy given there was literally nobody left to oppose her in doing so. This measure was seen as somewhat undemocratic in nature, not helped by the strong suspicion that Doris lied to the king in order to get his approval for the rogue squadroning, a sentiment that some feel is lent credence by the popular impression that Doris has lied about every single claim to truth she has ever made from the age of 4 onwards. Doris disputes this, citing the lack of remaining evidence that she never told the truth before the age of 5 as proof that the allegation is baseless. In any case, now that Doris's Liberatives have invoked emergency powers to continue managing Bestia following the failure of their legal battle to overturn the last election result, the government is continuing to spearhead the wall demolition cancelling project. Other current projects of theirs include the attempt to ban the colors of the Arvikian flag, red, white, and blue, which coincidentally are the same colors as the Bestian flag, from all physical objects within Bestian territory, and the proposal to unite the concerebral and Liberative parties into a single People's Party, on the basis that it would save everyone the hassle of having elections, with both parties actually agreeing for once that such a development would better reflect the democratic will of the people. In support of this conclusion, they cite recent opinion polls that indicate 99% of the Bestian public no longer see the point in voting in their elections. The Cadillac Cats have been wreaking havoc around Arvich for over 10 years, and Officer Nibble has made it his personal crusade to bring them to justice. No other authority is as invested as him, possibly because the Cats' actions amount to little more than petty vandalism, mainly graffiti and rumor-mongering. Nibble strongly believes that the Cats are responsible for the spreading of the infamous rumors about Quonus, aka Qualem, village, and that they made them up to sow discord and unrest in society. Most people take the Quonus tales quite seriously, but not Nibble. he'll never rest until he's brought the gangsters in. He denies it's got anything to do with him being a Mausian and them being Kations. Even with his gammy eye, he's very good at sniffing their trail, but not quite as good at actually apprehending them. They have a habit of tricking their way out of his custody. Fairies have a troubled history with Kations, or at least they think they do. It's all so far in the past now that the hatred just self-perpetuates at this point. These mystical fairy creatures are not eons. They dwell in forests and keep to themselves. For various reasons, their relationship with the Kations was always strained, to the point that the bat started to accuse them of things. Monstrous things. This eventually reached a point where Kation society became consumed by a bizarre belief that fairies had a practice of sneaking into little bat babies' rooms in the middle of the night and abducting them, replacing them with an imposter known as a fairy snatchling, not to be confused with the unicorn snatchlings. It was popularly believed that such babies would show subtle signs of their true nature as they got older, exhibiting odd behaviors like doing strange gestures with their hands, being unable to talk, and generally coming across as a bit weird and off in some way. Out of blind paranoia and swept into a mass hysteria over this belief, the Kations murdered these suspected snatchlings in droves, before some developments in Kation psychology eventually led them to realize that the snatchlings were all in fact their own children after all. Unable to cope with the horror of what they'd done, the Kations proceeded to blame all this on the fairies themselves, believing that they had deliberately invented this baseless rumor in order to destroy the Kations from within. In the end, it all went to even darker places. Now, neither species will ever trust the other again. The Domritic is a revolutionary freedom fighter who has gotten it into his head that Emperor Damaric isn't actually the wonderful ruler he's popularly believed to be, and that he is in reality a tyrannical dictator who rules a horribly repressive empire with a murderous iron fist. He's convinced that people have forgotten how much better things used to be in the good old days before the Arvich Empire was created and Damaric took the throne. The Domritic hijacks wireless broadcasts to spread anti-imperial messages in an attempt to counter the state propaganda that he believes is brainwashing the citizens into blind submission to a corrupt and insufferable regime. Because of his actions, he's one of the most wanted fugitives in the whole empire, but he somehow still manages to continue his hijackings without getting caught. Curiously, although official state opinion polls show that 100% of the Arvikian public love their emperor, the Domritic's broadcasts attract a massive audience. To help him in his quest, he's recruited a wide array of collaborators to help him spread his message, often doing collaborations over the wireless with them that his audience tend to find painful to listen to, and wonder why they insist on doing them when there's far more interest in their solo broadcasts. Although the collaborators are supposed to be equals, there's a common perception that the Domritic sees himself as far more important than them and constantly hogs the spotlight in all of these collaborations. This came to a head in his latest collaboration, an extremely self-indulgent broadcast that lasted for 15 hours, during which he took an entire well-respected song album and turned it into a crass parody version making fun of Damaric, where he and a bunch of weirdians nobody had ever heard of before spent the whole song ranting about how much they wanted to decapitate Damaric and all of his advisors. Listeners had the very unnerving sense that the Eon singers in particular were drooling at the thought of cutting their heads off as if it was some kind of twisted sexual fantasy. But in a later Q&A, the Domritic said he hadn't noticed the disturbing implications, which seems to happen a lot with him. There was another collaboration where two of the participants objected to a scene he'd written for them that seemed to heavily imply something very disturbing was going on. They claimed that when they confronted him about this, he didn't understand what they were talking about, and it took them several hours of going over it with him before he finally got it. A similar thing happened once when they hijacked a broadcast studio, and the Domritic spent half an hour trying to figure out how to get himself on the air, before one of his collaborators pointed out that he needed to press the giant red "Get Yourself on the Air" button that had been right in front of his face the whole time. His 15-hour sing-along broadcast finally ended with the very strong implication that the Domritic was going to stop ranting about how horrible the empire was and starts a show about tomato farming instead. He later expressed surprise and astonishment when his audience reacted negatively to this idea, so he reluctantly abandoned it and returned to his usual anti-Damaric ranting. None of his collaborators have been heard from since, including the weird sex fetishians from his last broadcast. Much of his audience miss the old collaborators that the DREADCRUMBS used to work with and wonder what happened to them. Rumors have emerged that their relationship wasn't as pleasant as it was made out to be, with stories of mistreatment and abuse running rampant. Some hold the DREADCRUMBS himself responsible for all of this, although not everyone's so sure it's all his fault, as a lot of the rumors seem to heavily center around a mysterious unknown figure who supposedly commands tremendous power over the DREADCRUMBS for some reason, behaving like some kind of tyrannical puppet master behind the scenes, just like the DREADCRUMBS accuses Emperor Demarek of being. This shadowy figure is believed to be responsible for events like the time when the DREADCRUMBS started a game show that lasted long past the point where it should have been obvious nobody liked it, and when he tried to do a Let Me Play session on an LGN game that was so cringeworthy it inspired a pair of popular comedians to do their own broadcast making fun of it. Besides relatively innocent controversies like these, some of the things this puppet master is suspected of are very sinister indeed, the most notorious of which being the alleged cover-up of a certain Wolfian collaborator's purported actions. Also, whatever you do, don't mention credit cards to the DREADCRUMBS. He doesn't take it well. Unknown to almost anybody in the world, there actually is a group of intergalactic space explorers who resemble the Star Fox group. They call themselves the Space Blasters and dedicate themselves to doing nice things and stuff like that in space, always looking out for distress signals and coming to the rescue of anyone who needs their help. Don't dwell on them too much, it'll be a very long time before they become relevant to anything. There might possibly be another group that resembles the Star Fox team in another way, but the less said about them the better. HMPH. Available for purchase from your local retailer today is the Mower Show Activity Book, a fun-filled pack of activities for your little ones to enjoy. The pictured image is the fun Draw the Cut mark on the nihilistic donkey death goddess activity. The book also has a coloring in section, which is a real hit with toddlers. It's just a shame that so many of the little children are reported missing shortly after getting the book. Such a shame indeed. Grace Cuddleheart's Fluffery, her canonical name, likes to close her raunchy, blackcurrant-fueled cabarets with her favorite hymn, which she wrote herself in her parochial house situated on a small island off the coast of Bestia, with literally nothing on it except Grace's house. Rumors say all she ever does there is sit on her armchair, drink blackcurrant juice, and shout random vulgarities for no apparent reason, while playing Hotel Mario on her Philips BDI. It's said in hushed tones that there might be some other unspeakable things she gets up to in there as well. After all, she's not the Messiah, she's a very naughty girl. Grace's second middle name is Snuggle Snugs. Her third is Sweetie Bubbles. They're also canon, even though they're not on her birth certificate. Grace used to have a lot more Game Boy game sets, but she ended up destroying all of them in a rage when she couldn't beat them, like a child throwing a temper tantrum. She has a habit of turning violent on things she perceives to be screwing her over, including games, but she would never let anything happen to her precious Hotel Mario. Masculine meanwhile hates all Nintendo systems and anything remotely associated with the Mario Brothers, and mainly plays on Sega players and handhelds, even the cylinder-guzzling Game Gear. Nobody else in the current Mower Force cares about video games, or game sets, as they call them, at all. But watch this space. What a weeoing load of weeoing. I mean, I'd rather have a buffalo take a weeoing in my ear. I'd rather eat out the rotten weeoing hole of a roadkill skunkion and down it with blackcurrant juice. Weeoing, I died. You've gotta be weeoing kidding me. What the weeoing is this weeoing? Did they even test this game before they released it? I mean, they might as well say, you're dead, your friends are dead, your family's dead, your weeoing pets are being skinned alive, your mom's a weeoing, you're going to the locker, deal with it. Cowabunga. Cow-weeoing piece of dog weeoing. It sucks, it weeoings, it's so weeoing suck it weeoings, it weeoing sucks, it weeoing blows, it's a piece of weeoing, and I don't like it. Still trying to find a weeoing port of Hotel Weeoing Mario for this weeoing Game Boy thing. They must have made one. Not that it weeoing matters, obviously, but I want it much. Like her shopping and Sonic the Hedgehog obsessions, Masculine has a fixation with small children's characters from wireless broadcasts and a medium known as cartoon books. She generally keeps it to herself for fear of ridicule, but to this day she believes she once read the infamous cupcake story from the Happy Little Horses cartoon book series, a widely known, but apocryphal book that multiple generations have sworn they remember reading as children, but for whose existence no evidence has ever been produced. Somewhere out there, many years ago, two young friends shared a wonderful dream together. They never forgot. If only it had never ended. The children claim that there's an obscure book in the Happy Little Horses series where one of the main characters goes insane and starts brutally murdering her friends to offer them as blood sacrifices to a pagan goddess. This book couldn't possibly have been real, as the independent publishing records for the series clearly show, and it is in fact an old urban legend that continues to thrive, with the claim also being made about the new wireless broadcast version of the Happy Little Horses. It can safely be assumed that all the people who honestly swear they remember reading this book or hearing the broadcast as a child are suffering from some kind of false memory or mass hysteria, as there is no documented evidence that any such episode was ever created or disseminated. Those who claim to have heard it on the wireless say the sounds and screams were disturbingly realistic, and that everyone else in the room with them just heard static when it played, which are classic signs of folklore embellishment. The persistent rumors that some of the children who read or heard the mythical story had disturbing dreams involving the goddess afterwards, and even started making blood sacrifices themselves, are also totally unfounded. It's all simply ridiculous. Scrapey joined the refugees because he found that all of his childhood friends, who had previously been very fond of him when they were young, abruptly and unanimously decided that they all hated him for the very same reasons that made them like him before, while also denying that they had ever liked him. They kicked him out of their friendship circle, and with nowhere left to turn, he joined the groovy gang, hoping to start a new life in Bestia. Wolfowns have some sick and twisted urges. Grace knows all about that. Unlike Grace though, most wolves have the decency to keep these urges to themselves since they know how deeply disturbing and unrelatable they are to non-wolves, but one such urge is so powerful as to be practically impossible to contain, especially for the males. At least they stick to their own kind, people say, as they pass by.